first of all, actually, let me congratulate you on the publication of this book, because
Thank you.
that's really a wonderful book. And a great accomplishment. But that said, let me invite you to maybe start us off by reading a passage from the book itself.
All right, great. So this is a passage that basically covers a little bit my approach to looking at textiles and a little bit what the book is about. Another venue to finding women, the focus of my research is to assess changes through time and the variation across space in one of the industries women controlled, textiles. Globally, textiles have been produced by both men and women, yet textile production and the manufacture of clothing were overwhelmingly women's work in traditional European societies. Medieval Icelandic and Danish colonial sources document that textile production in Iceland was in the hands of women, even though the total process from raising sheep to trading cloth and making cloth was served by an engendered division of labor. Across the North Atlantic, until the mid-18th century, the task of cleaning and combing wool, spinning, weaving, and producing clothes were women's work. In Viking Age burials, North Atlantic women were frequently interred with weaving and spinning implements. They also embroidered woolen cloth, knitted with a single needle method called nálbindung, and during the 16th century began knitting with 2 needles. Through the course of 9 centuries, Icelandic women produced these textiles in their households without specialized craftsmen or factories. In Greenland, the Faroes, North Scotland, rural Norway, the situation was similar. Weaving and textile production were female activities undertaken on farms. From the mid-18th century onwards, however, these gendered relations of production changed, and under Danish and British colonial policies to modernize North Atlantic societies, men were trained to produce textiles in factories using new technologies. So understanding the changing roles of women in North Atlantic societies is therefore a part of a study of the different roles of cloth within these North Atlantic islands and the interrelationships these roles suggest about the local and trans-regional importance of domestic production. Therefore, I have argued that by looking at textile production as women's labor, at the material culture of textile production, at the processes of women's production as rich bodies of evidence for women's active decision-making, we can begin to identify these women and the roles that they played in shaping the societies of the North Atlantic. In addition to decision-making and the production of women's labor, cloth was about female expression. In a society where women were not equal to men and were not given equal voice, textiles provide a way for women to express themselves in terms of their opinions and solutions vis-a-vis challenges that face them. Norse society valued male verbal expression, the cultivation of poetic skills and verbal prowess, but how did women commune in such an environment? As Norman has argued, the weaving of cloth and the embroidery of wall hangings and tapestries were visual mechanisms that women in Norse society used to express their message. And Berlo drew a similar pattern in Latin America, where women demonstrate a visual fluency and cultural knowledge in the molas they weave, constituting an alternate form of discourse. There too, male expression has largely been focused on verbal skill. Textiles are loaded with social messages. They assert personal identities as well as religious, economic, and cultural ones. And for anthropologists and those interested in the cultural ramifications of cloth, textiles, and here I quote Berlo, are eloquent historical texts encoding change, appropriation, oppression, and endurance, as well as personal and cultural aesthetic vision.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that you know, one of the things that it's hardest to see, no matter where it is that you're talking about or when it is that you're talking about in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages and into the high Middle Ages, are these everyday lives of women, right? The labor of women, the contributions of women to this society, which it's so easy, or these societies, which it's so easy to overlook. And you really, I mean, for me, I think the thing that I appreciated most, that I loved most about this book, is the way in which you really kind of forcefully foreground that.
Right.
So maybe that's a good kind of jumping off point to ask what you see as the biggest contribution that this book is making to our understanding of the history of the North Atlantic.
Well, I think that in what you just said, actually, you sort of nailed it, I guess. It's that a lot of the archaeology that's been done in this region has not been about women. We've been talking a lot about, there's been a lot of environmental archaeology that's been done, which is great. but it's dealt a lot with issues of subsistence. It's dealt with leadership, with power, with settlement. But that's frequently from the perspective, it's from a male perspective. And not really thinking that, in fact, in the settlement of the North Atlantic, women were equally as important and equally a part of this process. I mean, there's basically, it's half the population that you're not talking about. And what were their roles? What did they have to say? How do you find them? We happen to be blessed, actually, particularly in Iceland, to have such a rich body also of medieval literature, as you know, that gives us, additional information about this. But then again, who wrote those texts? Was it women who wrote these texts? Again, it's always dealing within the male realm. And I thought at some level, this is an area where, in fact, the female perspective was really lacking. And so one way of getting at that, if women are not considered equal or not given an equal voice within the society during that time, would actually be to look at the things that they made. And that brings me to another point. So I said the first contribution is kind of to establish, first of all, a female voice in the settlement of the North Atlantic, that women were an active part of this process as well. But also that in turn helps to establish a gendered archaeology of the North Atlantic as well, which has been done a little bit. There's been a few studies on burials. My own PhD was on trying to look at issues of gender, but not only gender, also identity through dress and adornment. But there's been a couple of PhDs on looking at gender in Icelandic burials, for example, but really a gendered archaeology has not really happened yet. And I'm not talking about, historical text or work that's done on sagas and whatnot. I'm talking mostly in archaeology. The other thing I think that this helps to contribute, or a good contribution and brings to light, is that the textile material in the North Atlantic, some parts of it are well known, like Greenland has been thoroughly studied by Elsa Østergaard. There are the Faroes, not very much. There's not a lot of material in the Faroe Islands either. But Iceland was sort of an interesting revelation. And when I first went there, actually in 2009, we were working on a site in Western Iceland, and we started to find textiles in this midden that we were excavating. And subsequently after that, I applied for a grant to kind of assess the situation of textiles in the National Museum, like what were their collections like. And I was really surprised to find that there were these huge textile collections, and by huge, I would estimate at this point, and this is constantly changing, so the number is a little bit of a fluid number, but the collections range between about 8,000 to 10,000 fragments of cloth. And they had been analyzed by some textile people. There was one in particular from Iceland, Elsa Guðjónsson, who sadly passed away a few years ago. And she looked at a few of these pieces, but she didn't look at the bulk of this massive stuff. She was interested in finer textiles. I have to say immediately that these textile collections are not beautiful, glamorous embroideries or whatnot. They are really brown rags that came out of middens, So, she was more interested in the nicer stuff, and I can't blame her for it. So nobody had really tackled the task. It's sort of like doing an analysis of nails, It's just there's thousands of these pieces of cloth, and they're not very exciting when you look at them. So the goal was really, okay, I'm going to undertake this huge task, which is of course not finished, and start to, to look at what is this material telling us? Of course, everything looks the same. And then it's simply by bringing that to light, I think it brought a lot of information about, basically the society and the economy in the society. Again, from a female perspective, because women were the ones who wove in Norse society. So I think that answers your question, sort of. Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I think those are three super important things, and I would agree that the book does all of them and does all of them well. I mean, it's a really important contribution, I think, to our understanding of this time and place. And you've got a wonderful, it's a quotation and then a kind of a reflection on that quotation from Njál's saga about the importance of cloth. I mean, the things that cloth does in this society. So I wonder if you'd indulge us with maybe another reading, and then we can sort of get into some of the questions, the bigger questions that the book
this passage is generally used to sort of illustrate basically mechanisms that women had to sort of provoke or to encourage men to seek vengeance for them in the saga context. But actually what I find more interesting is it really tells you something about the symbolism and what cloth really actually meant. And so it talks about Hildegund, who was married to the chieftain Hoskuld, who's been murdered, and she's trying to provoke her kinsman to seek revenge. So I'll start and take it from there. So this is a text actually that was transcribed by Miller in 1983. And he says, she, Hildegund, took out the cloak which Flosi had given Hoskuld and which he was wearing when he had been killed. She had preserved all his blood in it, and she returned to the hall with the cloak and quietly went up to Flosi. Flosi had eaten, and the food had been cleared from the table. And Hildegund flung it over Flosi, and the blood clots showered all over him. And then she said, you gave this cloak to Hoskuld, Flosi, and now I am giving it back to you. He was killed in it. I call God and all good men to witness that I charge you with all the powers of your Christ and your manhood and bravery to avenge the wounds he had on his body when he was killed, or else be called a neathing and contemptible creature by all men. So not only does this passage illustrate the importance of family honor, it also demonstrates the intimate relationships between women and textiles, as well as the power that textiles had to symbolize of the human skin. In this example, symbolizing the body and essence of the deceased person and his identity, it also reveals how women were perceived as having control over the destiny and fate of other humans, and all types of allegations that were incompatible with perceived males' ideals of the time.
It's such a wonderful passage. It's such a powerful passage. It gives such a clear sense of the power of cloth, of the power of textiles, of the way in which, I mean, they're in contact with our bodies. They are very much a part of our embodied experiences, you know, our sweat, our blood, if we happen to be murdered, unfortunately, get absorbed into these things. They shape the way we move through space. They shape, you know, our lives in very real and palpable ways. And that passage does such a wonderful job of showing how powerful that role of cloth in society is. And whenever you've got questions of power, you wonder, what are the men doing? Why aren't Norse women? Norse women are weaving. Why aren't Norse men weaving?
Right. Well, I think it's actually working through this material, it sort of, you know, struck me that, you know, that was kind of an interesting thought. Why weren't they actually weaving? And then this is where the sagas come in. And, you know, you could say, okay, these are just stories. But I think that these stories, as an anthropologist, I feel that they reflect deeper sort of thoughts and feelings about cloth and about this whole process, and which was actually a very, very gendered activity. I think that, in fact, this is not uniquely my idea. This idea was actually put forth by Karen Beck-Peterson in Scandinavia, who was writing about the significance of textile work, but of spinning as well, as being connected to the practice of witchcraft, of female witchcraft, or magic, if you prefer, that seers as the vulva would do during the practice of sedir. And that, in fact, spinning was intricately tied into this. And she brought a lot of really compelling arguments and examples from the sagas illustrating that point. And I think that I would take it even a step further, and I would say that actually I think that's definitely the truth. I think there's definitely a connection between, which is kind of obvious, and you kind of see this, that in a way the cloth is carrying your life essence. It's almost like it's carrying your soul. That at some level, textiles and making textiles is like making skin. It's like making a child. It's like controlling birth, which women do. And fate being such an important aspect in Norse society as well, I think comes into this, because you often have these images of the Valkyrie or the Norn or the Nornir weaving the fates of men. So you definitely have got, or spinning, I should say, the fates of men. Mm-hmm. So you've definitely got this imagery kind of lurking in the background. And I think that it actually, even the title of this book, and I actually have a couple, you don't have to actually mute yourself on this one because they're very, very short.
Sure.
the text that I in fact, which triggered the name of the book, The Valkyries Loom, is another one. This one from Njal's saga, and it's called the Darathardljóð. And I'm just going to read it through, and it says, "Blood rains from the cloudy web on the broad loom of slaughter. The web of man, gray as armor, is now being woven. The Valkyries will cross it with a crimson weft. The warp is made of human entrails. Human heads are used as weights. The heddle rods are blood-wet spears. The shafts are iron-bound, and arrows are the shuttles. With swords we will weave this web of battle." So the context of this poem is that basically there's a farmer called Doruð this is right before the Battle of Clontarf, and he looks up to the sky and 12 Valkyries come down. They go into the weaving hut, which was sort of, again, another secluded female gendered space, and would weave this textile, and he was watching them, and all the parts of the loom are basically weapons, and the wefts and the warps are entrails, and the loom weights are human heads. So these associations, again, with death and, potentially life, death, fate, they're weaving their fates, because obviously the outcome of that is this horrendous battle where all these Vikings end up dying. And I think it's kind of like a sort of a premonition sort of thing prior to this battle. And they end up leaving the 12 Valkyries, cut up the piece of cloth. They each take a piece of this cloth and then they disappear. And then obviously then the battle follows and, awful things happen. So I think that my feeling has been that there is something that we don't entirely understand here with regards to textile production, that in fact it may have been deeply associated with, I think potentially with the goddess Freya, who is also the goddess, in my opinion, who is connected with textile work. We get the name Friday from her, Freya, which was also the day, one of her other names is Horn, which means flax, and on Friday was the day when women would work flax. And I believe that this is really it kind of all goes together, and it ties together the fact that the loom itself is almost perceived as an engine of war, in a way, of death, but at the same time, weaving and spinning is almost like bringing life, and these associations of pulling life, of giving life, of fate. So I think all of this is all tied together. And it's possible that in the Viking Age, actually, this was like female juju or female magic, and men would go near it. You also, when you read, there's a lot of examples in the sagas of men who do engage in either textile work, or who peek through or get into the dinya, the weaving hut, and end up having awful things like dying and having horrible things happening to them. So there's like warnings about this a little bit, again, discreetly sprinkled here and there. And I think what happens is that in the medieval period and in the subsequent period, because the period I'm working on is a very broad one from basically the Viking Age to the 1800s. And there's a reason for that. But anyways, I'll get to that later. I think that, this resistance to men getting involved in textile work actually goes on and on right into the early modern period. And I think it's not that we don't want to get involved in textile work because, it's potentially dangerous for men to do that. I think that might have been a reality in the Viking Age. But in more than one culture, anthropologists will see that actually, people may not remember the original story, but the attitudes prevail. And so it just becomes in the medieval period, men don't do. That's it,
Right.
You also have another interesting thing that happens during that period is that at the end of the Viking Age, they also stop using these weaving huts, which are very much linked to this activity and very much linked to this female sort of environment and place where women, wove and potentially did practice Seiðir and other things. And they move the weaving moves indoors. And I think there's two reasons for that. On one hand, I think the weaving hut itself is very much associated with the older religion. And with the onset of Christianity, a lot of these houses are decommissioned and probably considered as, evil or whatever. But in Iceland, at the same time, you also have a shift economically, and cloth starts to become a very important economic item. And that could be the other reason why, they're actually moving activities. But even though the activities are becoming more part of the general living area, men are still not involved in it. So,
it comes across very strongly, this idea of a taboo against men engaging in anything.
I think there is a taboo, definitely.
Yeah. It's very striking. And as you say, I mean, this isn't my area of specialty, of course, but I wasn't as aware of these kind of weaving huts, but the physical separation and the kind of this creation of this secluded and what sounds like almost kind of subterranean
They are.
separate space for women to engage in this activity. It sounds, it's really striking, that separation.
They are actually semi-subterranean pit houses. And some suggest even that the entrances were via the roof, which is often the case with pit houses, which gives you even more of this kind of womb-like sort of environment, sort of female gendered space, which is almost like an enclosed womb area where women do their stuff and they make life, or they make skin, they make something that you wear on your body as a skin,
Right. Yeah, it gives new meaning to this, to the idea of the clothes making the man or the woman.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely.
So what, I'm interested in the stories that you're able to tell in this book, the way you're able to use cloth to get at just a variety of kind of issues and questions that change our perspective on what's going on in the Viking Age and in the Scandinavian Middle Ages and early modern period. What are some of the stories that appeal to you most, or that interest you most, or excite you most, that you find?
I think some of the stories are, there's some that really kind of strike out, or that stand out, I should say, in the data that I was working through. Now, one thing I think I should say right from the start, there's a lot of different approaches, obviously, to textile work or textile studies in archaeology. And there's been a lot of emphasis on, very technical sort of analyses of textiles that sort of look at the details of weaving and the thread counts or the how things are spun, or, other details, which are, of course, hugely important and need to be done. And I have done a good share of that, I have to say. It's very painstaking work, and it's very slow. And it requires laboratory work, and it requires, obviously the help of other people as well, helping you with that. But for me, textiles are more than that, so I don't want that to be the means to the end, and that's the end of it, because then it's not very interesting. I mean, it doesn't tell you how these textiles are used in society. And what's always interested me is like, okay, you have this, you might be studying another data set, you might be looking at bones or something, but you're looking for the story in the bones. You're not just publishing the bones. And it's the same thing with the textiles. The textiles are very much about subsistence as well, about wool management, about farming. In fact, they're as important as other environmental data in some level. So it's these stories that I've really been after, and I've just basically followed the data, if you want, and it's led me to the economy of Iceland, for example, and the fact that in medieval Iceland, or at the end of the Viking Age, textiles became a form of currency. And it's generally thought that this currency was really sort of booming up until about 1300. Then after that, fish takes over the production. But what I see in my data is that's not true. Textiles continue to be used as a form of currency within Iceland until, basically the Danish trade monopoly in the 17th century. And they're also, and this is something I'm exploring at the moment, is that they're being traded all over Europe. Like, everybody wants this cloth. Why? It's cheap and it's affordable. It's not great cloth, but it's perfect for clothing the average person on the street, basically. So that's one big one. Another story that also surprised me was actually the issue of climate change, and how climate change. And one thing to bear in mind is that when the Norse settled the North Atlantic, we're in the medieval warming period. So the temperatures are much warmer. By about, I would say, the end of the 13th, early 14th century, the climate starts to plummet. And this is felt in different ways in different parts of the North Atlantic. In Greenland, there's actually a change in how they start weaving cloth. So they come from Iceland, and they're bringing a cloth a style of weaving that is basically from Iceland, but you start to actually see a deliberate shift in how this is made. And this is interesting because it actually is telling you the thought process and the decisions that these women had to take. They may not have been sharing it with anybody, but they certainly were. They were doing it to adapt to the environment and the declining weather conditions in Greenland. You also, one thing that's always interested me a lot is in, for example, in the cloth production in the North Atlantic, is that, this is a place where they keep the old loom, the warp-weighted loom. And I have one right behind me if you want to take a look there. And it's an upright loom. It's a Neolithic loom. And they keep this loom basically from the Viking Age until 1700. And they are spinning on drop spindles or high top whirls that you roll up your leg. So no spinning wheels and no flat treadle looms at all throughout the North Atlantic, you know. And basically in the 17th century with the Danish trade monopoly, there's progressively an interest by the Danes to sort of look at or to take over and to start modernizing Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and introducing a new sort of this new technology and turning textile production into a more profitable business. And I've often wondered, because it really there's a shift in gender roles at this point, and if in fact there's any form of resistance. And I think I found some resistance, because, you know, people are not going to want to change their ways of doing things, particularly if women have always woven and then suddenly men start weaving. You know, how's that going to be perceived, you know? And I think there was actually a form of resistance and of sort of pushing through with the traditional homespun cloth, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with this strongly kind of gendered approach to making cloth, it seems likely that you would find this kind of resistance. I want to pick that up maybe a little bit later, and I also want to come back to the issue of climate change. But the talking, you mentioning the different way in which women kind of adapted to climate change in Greenland as opposed to Iceland and perhaps elsewhere across the North Atlantic makes me wonder about the differences in the kinds of cloth that you see between Norway, Shetland, the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, all the way across the North Atlantic, and how this cloth production does change over time from the Viking Age into the medieval period and beyond.
Okay. So really, I would say, first of all, in terms of the kinds of cloth that you will find, it's pretty homogeneous across the entire region, all the way to Norway. So I would say that in terms, the weaves that you find, they're very similar, particularly in the Viking period. Afterwards, it changes a lot. But in the Viking Age, there are some broad, and I say loosely broad, similarities. However, one of the things that I wanted to see was in the first research grant I wrote on this, one of it was called Rags to Riches. I was really focusing on the Icelandic corpus, and I wanted to look at a time period from the Viking Age to the early modern period, for the reason that textiles and dress as well, I would say, it's not at all like today, where we are this fast fashion idea, the fact that we've got all these textiles, that we have so much abundance of clothing and whatnot, is totally an anomaly in the history of humanity, basically. And most of all, textiles and dress didn't change very much, because dress was very important in projecting your cultural identity, who you were, who your group was, where did you belong, and so on. So this is basically in I would say non-industrial settings, textiles and clothing change very, very slowly. And when they do change, it's because something's going on within society. So to take, for example, in Iceland, you may find, you're going to find a certain range of textile types. But in Viking Age Iceland, and I would say in Scandinavia and in Scotland as well, the textiles are really diverse. So there's a lot of diversity. There's more color. There's more, it's really, I always like to say the Vikings really love their bling. So they like flashy.
Yes, they did.
So they're very flashy in their approach. And it's funny because you find even Iceland, which is a bit more remote than, let's say Scotland, you find sort of a certain range of textiles in burials that are made in a certain way. And it's kind of fun to look at this material, actually. It's interesting, though, by the end of the Viking Age, it seems to drop down to two main weave types, or maybe three or four. So it goes from this, really flashy and lots of obviously 1,000 years ago, the colors are not what they were, but still really more intricate stuff and more diversity and so on, to basically down to 2 or 3 or 4 weave types. And everything looks really kind of drab in comparison. So what it turns out is that it could be in part Christianity. It could also be that because it's becoming such an economic item, that the if you want, the making of it becomes much more sort of standardized and organized and regimented, and so you end up with basically, because they're making money. So when you're making money, it has to be very standardized,
Right.
And then it sort of upticks again in the early modern period with an influx of a whole bunch of imported stuff. So then you have a much more complicated sort of corpus to deal with, So the Middle Ages is very much kind of always the same thing. The Viking Age is more diverse. And then by the early modern period, you're tearing your hair out because there's stuff from all over the place, because of trade in that point. So, but it's interesting to see sort of within, I was going to say, you could actually almost use that as a form of loose, if you wanted to date on the basis of stylistic properties. You could actually use this on your sites as a way to date, the kind, maybe the period, roughly the period of the site you're dealing with. Now, there are changes that do occur within the textiles themselves, and I'll talk about some of that a little bit later. But, and then so one of the things I wanted to do is that I wanted to, once I had done a large chunk of Iceland, I was wondering, well, for example, the currency issue, is this happening in Greenland as well? Is it happening in the Faroe Islands? Is it happening in Shetland? Is it happening in Scotland? And what I found is it's definitely not happening in Greenland. There is not the same level. There's not the same level of standardization. The textiles are quite different in their nature. There's other dynamics going on. For one, climate is a big issue. When it comes to Scotland, let's say comparing Viking Age to Viking Age Iceland to Viking Age Scotland, there are even differences there as well. You do find some of the same types of weaves, but you find, for example, there's one of the two big weave types that you find are the 2-2 twill. So if you have a tweed jacket, for example, that would be a 2-2 twill. And the other one is a tabby weave, which is a very simple weave of over one, under one. So it's the simplest weave that you can make. So you find, for example, in Iceland, in the Viking Age, in Viking burials, a lot of 2-2 twills, not a lot of tabby weaves, while in Scotland, you have a lot of tabby weaves and not a lot of 2-2 twills, which is very strange. So maybe the issue of currency, because the 2-2 twill becomes the currency, becomes Vatnamál, is already starting in Iceland earlier than we think. The other thing you find is another type of twill that you find in the Viking Age is called a diamond twill. And it's literally, it's like the same concept as a regular twill, except it looks like diamonds in the final product. And it's quite sophisticated, one of the more sophisticated types of textiles. Very few of it in Iceland, 3 or 4 pieces, and a lot more in Scotland. So there's a couple of things that could be going on here. Like, you almost have a feeling, looking at the textiles and the burials, I would say in Scotland, that things are a little bit wealthier maybe than in Iceland. They're also in close proximity to Ireland, to these big trade emporiums, and they're closer to Scandinavia as well. So that could be one of the. So that's the kind of sort of things that you see. And in fact, it's interesting if you wanted to look at an example of one of these situations. I was part of a project in 2015 that was run through the National Museum of Iceland that grouped a group of scholars from the University of Iceland, from the National Museum of Iceland, from Durham University, from Brown, and also from the National Museum of Denmark. So we were sort of a big team, each one looking at different categories of data, and I was looking at the textile data. So the project was actually called, The Lady in Blue, and some of you may have heard about this. And the interesting thing about this burial, it was a burial that was found sort of by accident from road building. And they found the remains of this woman. And just to make a long story short, they basically ended up in 1937, when it was excavated, they retrieved the skull of the deceased. So a lot of things were missing because they had gone in, they were building a road. A lot of these burials also have been eroding. There's big erosion problems. But in this case, they had actually found some parts of soft tissue remain from the person's face, which was then put away and in formaldehyde and placed in the National Museum. So this is probably the only soft tissue remains in the entire Viking world, which is pretty incredible. But at any rate, when we decided to look at this material again, and I was looking at the textiles, I had a series of analyses that I did, and this person was wearing sort of the traditional Norse type of garments with an outer apron, which you can see on the piece on the left. And you can actually see sort of like a diamond motif. And this is actually one of these diamond twills. And this is a tablet woven band on the top. And this was part of her outside, her sort of her pinafore, if you want, her apron that she wore on top. Generally, this was worn over a linen undershirt that could have been pleated. And we found evidence, there was a lot of mineralization, which happens when textiles come in contact with metal, that the textiles begin to sort of, corrode and turn into metal. So you actually get a lot of preservation that way, which is great. In fact, a lot of the Scottish textiles are actually mineralized like that. So it allows you to still do thread counts and whatnot. It's just that they're metal now, they're not cloth anymore. And this was a band which is done through a technique called card weaving or tablet weaving that was integrated into the weave. And this is actually a characteristic in the North Atlantic, which is typical of weaving on the warp-weighted loom in Iceland and the Faroes and so on, is that they would start with one of these tablet woven bands. And so that you had, this thing had been dyed blue. So we had analyzed the textiles. And then this piece here was very, very different. In fact, this is one of these 2-to-2 twills, which eventually becomes what they call vavmal, which is the cloth currency. And this piece was also dyed blue, but it was made very differently from this one. Now, one thing I've noted in my research is that, and I'm not the only one to have noted this, but in fact, in the Viking burials of Norway, of Scotland, and Iceland, textiles, when they spun the yarn in these Viking burials, they generally used yarns. When you spin yarn, you can either go clockwise or counterclockwise. When it's clockwise, we refer to this as Z spun yarn, or counterclockwise is S spun yarns. And they found actually that in the Viking burials of these three areas of Norway, Scotland, and Iceland, textiles were generally made with Z yarns in warp and Z in the weft. So we would refer to this as Z to Z. And in Iceland, you start to see the emergence of another kind of combination of Z with S, which is what this little piece here was all about. So they're both made very different. This one very much made in the Scandinavian tradition. This one, my theory about this, and I know some people don't agree with me on this, and my approach is very much of an anthropological one, is that this could, in fact, this introduction of Z to S spun yarns in Iceland could be the result of the introduction of people coming from the British Isles, because the people who settled Iceland were not exclusively Norwegian. You have, in fact, a cultural mix going on. And it's funny because this is the type of cloth that eventually moves on to becoming vavmal. Now, my theory is based on a bunch of studies that were done in the Southwest on spinning techniques in prehistoric Americas, where they also noted these variations in spin direction in various communities. One community would spin Z, the next one would spin S. So there was an archaeologist who'd done a whole series of experimental trials using modern spinners to see if there was any correlation between handedness or materials used, and they really found no correlation whatsoever. The only thing that she could say was that this is just what you learn from your mother or your father, and these are just traditions that are passed down. So at some level, these could also be used as identifiers of cultural traditions in textile production. And I have always seen this as the reason why you get this could in fact be the introduction of these Hiberno-Norse women coming into Iceland, as well as this typically sort of Norwegian way of producing cloth. It's also, I should say, that in the continent, they also make cloth in this way. And eventually, I mean, it's also possible that this is also introduced because of trade with other parts of the world. But that early on in the settlement, in 10th century, it's a little bit, maybe a little early to speak of that. At any rate, coming back to the origins, one of the things that we did is that I commissioned Karen Frey from the National Museum of Denmark to do some strontium isotope work on the wool. And she identified them both as being Icelandic. So they are both made in Iceland, even though the apron part is generally, it wasn't known that in fact diamond twills like that were actually made in Iceland. It was always thought that they were made in Scandinavia because they usually end up in places like Birka. And they're extremely fine. This one is not so fine, but it's nonetheless, it's made in Iceland. So,
I mean, it's remarkable. The metallization, first of all, that's pretty cool. So I guess what we're looking at here are the parts of her dress that were under the brooches, the clasps.
well, these ones actually, in her case, some parts were mineralized, but a lot of it wasn't. So, and the parts that are mineralized are stuck under the brooch still. These pieces were actually, we were really lucky that we actually had, non-mineralized or live textiles, if you want to call it like that. It sounds a bit strange.
I like that, live textiles.
Live textiles. These ones were actually there. I think that this is her apron, probably worn on the top here, and these are probably straps that were tied underneath the brooches. But interesting that they're made with different textiles, and both also coming from Iceland. With Icelandic wool. So it's very interesting,
No, I mean, I think the idea that, as you say, that this is a technique, that spinning is a technique that you learn at your mother's knee or father's knee, but in Iceland at your mother's knee. And in conjunction with what we've seen in terms of the genetic evidence of the genetic background, the DNA evidence for the genetic background of the modern Icelandic population coming both from Scandinavia, but also from the British Isles. This explanation of kind of a process of acculturation to different ways of spinning makes a lot of sense to me. That sounds, that's fascinating. And you say that this is what becomes vadmal. So that then, this has got to be the most famous cloth from, Viking Age and medieval Iceland that there is. So how did you go about identifying vadmal in the archaeological record?
Well, vadmal, it's funny because it's a term that's kind of loosely used, but actually, if you really wanted to be very, very specific about it, it really should only be used for cloth currency. And it means actually vav is cloth and mal is to measure. So it is cloth that is made to measure. So it goes without saying that it's pretty much currency. Now, here again, we're very lucky because there is a big body of medieval law codes that give you information, about sort of, how this stuff is supposed to be woven, what it looks like, and so on and so forth. So what you have in the background here is the actual vadmal, and you can see this is a 2-to-2 twill and how it is woven, and it's over 2, under 2. Like I said, if you took a look at your tweed jacket, it's made exactly in the same way. And here you've got a microscopic view of it. So in the medieval law codes, they actually have, just to show you how it got to be quite structured and organized, in the text of Graugas. It's called thrískeft in Icelandic, which means 3 heddles, which is because it's made out of 3 heddles. And they actually had legal standards for this cloth and how it was supposed to be woven and what constituted the legal measures. So what I did is I went first of all to looking at what had been done on the texts, and there's been a lot of work done on reading Graugas itself and also looking at whether other people had talked about it in terms of its legalities and whatnot. And as it turns out, the legal vadmal, the basic unit of measure, which was always equivalent to basically 1 ounce of silver, so that was always the basic unit. But the general thought is that at the end of the Viking Age, they run out of silver. And it's possible that, in fact, they had a lot of wool, so wool comes to replace it as the basic unit of measurement. And as you move along, as I started reading more in the law codes, I found that they actually stopped talking about silver, and it becomes mostly just cloth, becomes the basic unit of measure. So basically, legal vadmal was to measure 2 ells in width and 6 ells in long or in length. So that's equivalent. If we think that 1 L is equal to 49.2 centimeters, so that's supposed to be actually somebody's forearm, more or less. So that would be basically like 50 centimeters. So you're talking about 1 meter by 3 meters long is the basic unit of measure for legal vadmal, that amount. And this can change, like the actual L itself as a measurement changes also at various times. It goes up to 55.6 centimeters. It was actually less before that. So you have these modifications that are happening, and they even change the basic unit over time, which is another way that, or another indication that this cloth as currency is not being abandoned after 1300, but is persisting right up until, I would say, the arrival of the Danes. So what happened? So how did I identify it? Well, I basically, first of all, by the sheer numbers, because there was so much of it. And I mean, it was everywhere. There's just some sites, it was just one piece after another, and every single piece was identical to the last one. I was just like, oh my God, wow, is this ever going to stop? You know, it was just endless. So that was part of it. But then what I was doing, and this is where the actual analytical part comes in, is that one of the things I was doing was I was spending a lot of time counting threads. And the advantage of counting threads is the thread count does give you kind of a barometer of how well woven or how finely woven something is or not. Even if you buy sheets today, you'll find that your sheets will have a thread count, usually in the 3,000 range or something, because we're making very, very fine textiles. But and so this is a way to sort of see and to look for patterns in the data. This is just to show you a little bit when I had a bunch of data of these thread counts. So counting using 1 centimeter and counting how many threads there were per 1 centimeter in the warp yarns and then in the weft yarns. I was able to plot this data on a graph. And then what sort of jumped out at me was, in fact, how tightly clustered this stuff is together. And this is a range of medieval vodmal from basically 11th to 16th century, more or less. And you can see that there is a real sort of tightness. And I think what you're seeing there is you're seeing standardization. It is a form of currency. In the zooarchaeological record, they find a real increase in the breeding of sheep in the early medieval period, probably associated with this. And then archaeologically, you're finding, these textiles are so, how they're made is so densely packed that they're clearly following certain guidelines as to, how it's supposed to be made. So it's kind of an interesting thing, is that, to me, so thinking about it in practical terms, it seems there's no trades, there's no big sort of trade emporiums like you find in the British Isles, for example, in Iceland. This stuff is found on almost every single farm. So it's produced on every single farm. We are not talking about guilds here. We are not talking about centralized production or organization in any kind of way. This is individual work being done on farms by women who are weaving money. Which is kind of like, wow, they're weaving money, that's a pretty significant role in society. I think the medieval law codes come in and they regulate the money. And if you want, this is a kind of a, two genders are working together. Obviously it's the basis of the economy, they will. But the role that women are actually controlling this production is really significant and really important. And, it's not entirely sure how that was organized. I suspect that it had to be made on, every farm, or it's possible that there were some women who were really good at identifying vodmal. And I have to tell you that, having seen enough vodmal now in my life, I can pretty much look at it now and tell you exactly what grade it is. So I imagine if I can do that, imagine what they can do, I'm sure they can do much more. And it's been a little bit more difficult actually to find information on what were we have an idea of how wide it has to be, how long it has to be, but how did it actually have to be made? How many thread counts did it actually have to have? Right. And for that, we don't have a lot of information. We don't have, and I wonder if it's because, in fact, it was somewhat arcane knowledge in a way. It was kind of know it. And the women knew this, and so it wasn't written down in any law codes. And there's been a couple of attempts to try and identify, and I'm just looking for some, here we go, of basically, what does it say? What do the law books tell us about, about this sort of thing, about, the thread counts? Was it supposed to be certain thread counts? Like I had noticed roughly between, 6 and about 14 warp threads per centimeter, and that's the warps are the vertical ones, would probably constitute your legal vodmal. There was a woman in the 50s called Marta Hoffman who wrote a book on the warp-weighted loom, who did a little bit of research into this, into some of the Icelandic collections. And she said she was having a hard time finding anything as well in the medieval law books, and found that it was roughly probably between 4 and 15, more or less. There's also an Icelandic historian called Helgi Thorlaksson who did a PhD on the Vatnamál, but again, he did it from the law book. So again, from a male perspective, looking at the legalities of it and so on. But in the later period, he was actually able to identify different grades of it. And he identified a type of cloth that was actually between 9 to 10 warp threads per centimeter. And this is 1640, so that's quite late, when you think about it. And he called that stuff, or it was called gjaldavod, which is equivalent probably to the currency. That's the currency cloth, which is what you're seeing on the screen right here. He also found that they refer to a klæðavod, which would have been the clothing that you dress with, which was 11 warp threads per centimeter, and then an even higher one called smávod, which was 11 to 14 warp threads per centimeter. And I have found cloth like that, and that was generally thought to be textiles that you would actually pay in taxes and tithes to the church. So the fine material. So what's interesting about this stuff, though, is that from my observations, looking at it from the actual material culture itself, is that you find that obviously these farms were making vatnamál and then, probably stockpiling it to some extent, but also reusing it as clothing. Because by the time I'm looking at it, it's had many, many lives. It's gone from probably currency to then being turned into clothing till eventually it fell apart. And then it became a patch in something and recycled, or turned into a blanket or a sail, part of a sail, so there's a huge sort of movement. Textiles have more than one existence. It's a multiple kind of life situation.
Well, that raises this question of, just how much work is this? I mean, to spin and to weave cloth, to pay in taxes, to clothe your family, that's got to be an enormous amount of labor.
It is a huge amount. And I actually dedicated a whole not a whole part of a chapter to this in the book, which you can read about with all kinds of calculations. And I'm just gonna
save us the calculations today, Michèle.
It's really complicated. There's a lot here. There's been various sort of things that have been published about how much cloth was needed per family or per farm and per household. And there's various studies that have been done. One of the studies that was done by Tom McGovern, who was really looking more at how much sheep did a household need and how many pelts do they need to make and so on. Looking also at ratios between cattle and sheep and so on. And then there's others who focused more on the actual, production time using experimental archaeology. Some of the estimates that were published in McGovern's work actually is that they estimated 30 to 60 kilograms of wool for clothes, 30 kilograms for bedclothes, 10 kilograms for sails and sundries, 12 for taxes and tithes, and 70 kilograms for land rent. Now, this is from a source that is actually taken, I think, from a more recent source, 17th, 18th century source, which may not be applicable to the early Middle Ages. And there's a couple of things that and it was collected, I think it was actually collected in 1740, but it is talking about a time that is not so far away from that person's life. So not looking into, the very early Middle Ages or what's going on in terms of vatnamál in that context. And one of the things that have been sort of ignored is the fact of all the cloth recycling that goes on, because these people are reusing cloth like crazy. So what I did is I took also the work of Eva Andersen Strand, who did a lot of practical kind of experimental work through Lejre in Denmark. They have an experimental archaeology center there. And she came to slightly different values of cloth needed, and then also combined that with somebody else who had done experimental work on weaving. And I kind of put all those studies together and I came out with some crazy numbers, also looking at household size, which was included in Tom McGovern's argument, and looking, for example, at a household of 4 people. And according to these combined studies, and looking very much at the practical side of it, because obviously Eva Andersen Strand work was looking at what did it actually take women to spin, or what did it actually take women to weave. And we found that looking also at, sort of population, sort of distribution in households, that in a household of 4 people, you may have had one woman who was able to do textile work. And it would have taken her to clothe her family of 4 about 260 days to weave and spin. And if you had a household of 10 people with 2 women who could do the work, it would have taken them 325 days to spin and weave and sew. And a chieftain's household with 20 people would have taken you up to 325 days. And a manor with 40 people would have taken you also 325 days with 8 people working at it. So it's just
producing cloth.
Right. So you have to do, a few things. Either you've got an economic system where you're receiving cloth as well, which is helping to to produce. But I have a feeling that in Greenland, that wasn't the case. And I have a feeling, they were not making currency in Greenland. I mean, that's clear. They also shift to breeding more goats. So a lot of the textiles are thought to have goat in them as well. And I think that things were a little tougher in Greenland, and they were probably also incorporating pelts into their garments, because they were also sealing a lot. At this point, and the conditions were colder and whatnot. So my sense is that Greenland life was hard, and to keep up with that level of work with all the rest that you had to do as a woman, which was also cooking and potentially looking after children and milking animals, and I mean it's like you wouldn't have much time to do anything really. So yeah, I think they were stretched a bit actually in as far as cloth goes.
Yeah, it seems like it. I mean, it really gives, again, this is one of these things that gives you a whole new appreciation of just exactly how people are spending their time. I mean, if you're talking 260 to 320 days a year just producing cloth, I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, and you came back to it just now, the what's going on in Greenland, right? The way in which women in Greenland and women in Iceland as well are adapting to the change of the climate with the little ice age. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I could also. I'm just thinking in my slides. I think can we have the next slide, please? Oh, we have the hat.
Ah, yes, the hat, the famous Burgundian hat.
Yeah, because I was just thinking in my slides, I had put something else about what you asked actually farther on, but I'll just pick up the issue of just briefly recycling. Is that, I think the way the Greenlandic women actually catered to that issue was by recycling, or what they call upcycling maybe today.
Nice.
Incorporating lots of pieces of cloth. And this is something I found throughout Iceland and a lot in Greenland, a lot of patching of garments, of trying to stretch the lives of the garments, as much as possible. And I think it's something you also find in maybe less industrial societies anyways. I'm just thinking about even my own great-grandmother would recycle cotton bags of, that they used to put sugar in. And she turned these into nightgowns. So everything was like reused all the time, and I still have like pillowcases and nightgowns with embroidery on them, with on the side of it, the sugar thing on the inside, so you wouldn't see it, the stamp of the sugar bag. But in Iceland, I've heard the same thing. People think, oh yeah, my grandmother always recycled all the cloth all the time, and it's very much of a common thing to do this. And this crazy piece, and this is not the only one, comes from, it's called the Burgundian Tall Hat, and it comes from the site of Haraldsnes in the south of Iceland, south of Greenland, which was a graveyard where they found a lot of, in fact, probably the best preserved collection of medieval garments in existence, completely preserved. And I've looked at most of them, all heavily patched as well, lots of patching going on. And I have to actually say that I owe this work in particular to Jette Arneborg from the National Museum of Denmark, who's been working in Greenland most of her career. And we were looking at these garments together, and she said, well, there's this tall hat here. And it was excavated quite early on, I think in the 1920s, by Paul Norlund, who didn't really know how to place and contextualize a specific hat because there was nothing like it. He didn't have anything like it. The other garments, they were able to sort of, try and figure out parallels maybe in Europe. One thing to say also about these garments is that they were probably, the styles of them are actually older than the textiles themselves, suggesting that they may have been slightly outdated by, European standards, but they were also not used or not worn on the skeletons were not wearing the garments. They were wrapped in them like shrouds. So the hats were, some of the Leary pipe hoods were placed on the feet and then tied around the feet. And this particular hat, which was really quite unusual, had these patches on. Apparently they found teeth on the inside of it. And he didn't know what to make out of it because it's really quite tall. So she said to me, she said, why don't we date? Let's date some of these patches and see what happens,
Mm-hmm.
And she had dated the body of the hat earlier on, and came out, with a date. Actually, I put the dates on here. Basically, the body, it was very comparable to what we did, basically between 1275 and 1307 for the body of the hat. Mm-hmm. And she, so we dated 2 more, and I put actually in red, you can see the patches that we took, or where we took the samples. We ended up with a comparable body, or comparable date to the body that she had had. But what was the real shocker was the crown, where we got a date of 1139, which was almost like 100 years earlier than the actual body, which really makes you think, wow, what are they doing here? Like, is this an heirloom? Is this something that they are, keeping? Is it sort of like, what's the story behind this?
Yeah.
Where does it come from? It's definitely not Burgundian. It's much too early for that. But she actually thought, they do wear these kind of hats in Iceland as part of the national costume, that you find sort of in illustrations and whatnot in the 18th century, 17th century, of these tall women's hats that they wear. And there are, I think there's even a medieval engraving of one of these, or a painting of somebody wearing one of these very, very tall hats. So was it somebody from Iceland? Why keep such an old piece of cloth? Is there sort of an heirloom issue here, or is it just, oh, there it is, I'm just going to patch it together? Some of the other garments that I did the same thing to, we found that there was really often no difference in age. So it was just a matter of just taking cloth that was there and trying to salvage as much as possible, in the situation.
Yeah.
So
it reminds me of, there's a wonderful children's book called Jacob Had a Little Overcoat, which is all about exactly that process of taking the coat and then paring it down to like a vest, and then from a vest into, whatever, a tie or something. And eventually it ends up as a button. So, but this is a great example of that, as you say, that sort of upcycling, recycling of cloth.
Yep. Which we're doing a lot of now anyway. So
yeah, right. So, we should probably leave some time for questions, but I want to maybe end by asking how you mentioned earlier the Danish trade monopoly during the imperial period, colonial period, and how that changed women's lives, how that changed cloth production, textile production, spinning and textile production, all of that. And maybe just a few quick words about the early modern period.
Like I said, I think I said at the beginning, the loom, the warp-weighted loom, was the loom that was in use for, almost 900 years in Iceland, in the North Atlantic, in Faroe Islands as well. Greenland colony dies out roughly around 450 or so, so you have, basically we stopped talking about Greenland at that point, but the Faroe Islands definitely, and Iceland as well. And in 1603, the Danes imposed a trade monopoly in the North Atlantic to sort of control and stop all trade and people coming to Iceland and, profiting from the fish and the wool and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And they decided to sort of control the whole question and sort of direct trade towards Copenhagen instead. And one of the things that they start to do, and this is in sort of in the 1700s, early 1700s, they take a real keen interest in the wool situation in Iceland, because there's a lot of wool. It's great wool. And I think they start to think, well, we could make a profit out of this, that is actually, and turn it into a product that is more like what has already been producing. And they've been producing for, hundreds of years in Europe, these like fine worsted woolens and so on. So what they do is they really completely transform the wool industry in Iceland and in the Faroe Islands as well. And they basically start taking men and training them in Copenhagen on how to weave on these flat looms. They start introducing the flat looms. The first flat looms show up in 1700 in two of the big ecclesiastic sites of Hólar and Skálholt in Iceland. And they start to discourage people weaving on the warp-weighted loom, and instead try to, sort of get women instead to focus on spinning instead, and introduce the spinning wheel with that to supplement sort of the production that, and then they bring these men, they set up a workshop in Reykjavik in 1740, which is quite short-lived because it ends up burning up in a fire like 40 years later. But they are in that Reykjavik workshop, they are actually producing cloth that is very, very comparable to what you're getting in Europe, very difficult to distinguish between the European imports as well. A lot of this cloth is actually sent back to Denmark for inspection and then either sent back to the North Atlantic or traded elsewhere. So what I see this as a huge disruption in terms of gender roles within Norse society. Yeah. And I've often wondered if there were letters or texts of women complaining about this transition, of them taking away, or did they see this as, oh my God, finally, I don't have to do all this weaving anymore.
265 free days.
Yeah, whoa, and or how is this actually perceived? I think it's not entirely perceived well, because I think we've looked at some other sites with colleagues. And looking at, for example, this big ecclesiastic site, which is the Bishopric of Iceland at Skálholt, where you still are finding, even throughout the 1700s, a continued use of homespun, almost like they're sort of resisting the imports, or people are still, and this was a school. So there were boys coming from across Iceland who were going to school there and who were, basically bringing their clothing with them. So this reflects what was going on throughout Iceland. And I don't think it worked all that well, actually, in the final result. And then obviously the mills burned down, so that's that. But It did completely disrupt. Eventually what happens is the warp-weighted loom goes completely out of use, and nobody remembers how to even run it anymore. And then there's today in Iceland, there's a renewed interest in this. And so there's more and more people who are learning, in fact, how to weave on it again and how to. So it had, it really did change the whole sort of gender dynamic. You find also at that point that women switched to knitting too. So knitting becomes the big thing. In 1800, you have like incredible amounts of knitting of entire garments and fine knitting, like really. And I would say that even prevails today, that you still find that knitting is a really important activity that women do together, almost continuing from what happened in the past, what they were doing in the past.
Sure. Yeah, the famous Icelandic sweaters. I mean,
yes, of course, right.
Right. Huh.
Right.
That's, what an incredible change that must have been, especially again given the heavily gendered nature of textile production throughout the Middle Ages, but from well before that, to suddenly kind of shift things around towards industrial production, and to shift things around to having men be the ones who are doing the weaving. That must have been quite disruptive. And I can imagine you're right that there would be resistance to that.
From all sorts of. You think that there would be kind of, some people might have thought, this isn't right, or, or they're coming in with their snazzy new machines and so on. And, when this old loom had been in use for, so long and so integral to society and stuff. I think it must have been a bit sort of,
shocking.
Yeah. And you have also the issue of colonialism, and then on top of that, they're taking over, what we've been doing for thousands of years, sort of thing, that kind of feeling. Yeah. So I can imagine it must have been difficult to experience that. Yeah. So.
Well, fascinating, Michèle. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful book, and just as I think this conversation has shown, just opens up so many avenues, so many kind of new, unexpected, areas of insight. It's wonderful. It's fascinating. It's
Thank you.
Beautifully done. So congratulations.
I'd just like to say a big thank you to Jonathan for, for helping me with this, and Bob Purcell, our director at the Haffenreffer Museum, and also thank you to the Haffenreffer Museum for hosting this event as well, this virtual event. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks to the Haffenreffer, thanks to Bob, thanks to Michelle for it's a wonderful book and a very it's a page turner. It's a fast read because it's so
Textile.
fascinating. So wonderful job. Congratulations
Thank you.
again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.